Okay, picking up where I left off, we're still talking about slavery in the Bible. We're talking about slavery in the New Testament, but actually we're going to venture out of the Bible now, and we're going to look at what evidence do we have about the early church's actions in this area. And what I mean by early church, I'm talking about 1st and 2nd century, right at the beginning of the church. The early church saw the institution of slavery, and again, they're dealing with this system in the Roman Empire. And I've already spent a great deal of time demonstrating the differences between what they were experiencing in the Roman Empire and what was going on in the New World. So if you haven't seen the earlier videos, I suggest you go and look back, and maybe some of the things, the points we make a little better sense. The early church saw the institution as neutral enough to utilize it to meet the needs of other Christians or other church members. As I've already quoted in an early video, Clement of Rome states, "We know many among ourselves who have given themselves up to slavery in order that they could ransom some others. Many others have surrendered themselves to slavery so that the price that they received for themselves might be used to provide food for others." The early church apparently used their funds to procure freedom for their members to the limit of their ability. Quoting from a letter of Ignatius to Polycarp, "Do not despise either male or female slaves, yet neither let them be puffed up with conceit, but rather let them submit themselves the more for the glory of God, that they may obtain from God a better liberty. Let them not also long to be set free from slavery at the public expense, that they may be found not found slaves to their own desires." And then quoting from a history of the Christian church, we know that there were widespread freedoms among Christian converts, especially those of wealth. We have data about some actual freedoms in the pre-Constantine era that indicates that the principles of the New Testament indeed created more and more freedoms among Christians. The acts of freedoms were unintelligible if the church had somehow sanctioned slavery. In other words, these acts make sense only if the church had been taught that freedom was something owner masters should pursue for their servants whenever possible. A simple "just be better to your slaves" ethic would not have generated such events and patterns of basically letting slaves free as we've pointed out. As late as Constantine, we see still efforts by the church to free involuntary slaves. Quoting from Slave and Society at Rome, Keith Bradley, 1994, Augustine said that it was the practice of the Christian community to use its funds to redeem as many kidnapped victims as possible. And in one recent episode, 120 slaves from the Galatians were boarding or were preparing to board onto their ships to be saved. So, in summary and conclusion, dealing with slavery from the New Testament through the early church, the slave system described in the New Testament period is very dissimilar to the modern slavery as we know it, especially in regards to the more horrific and troubling aspects: lifetime slavery, forced violent enslavement, no chance for improvement in conditions, no legal recourses against owners, bad living conditions, and the lowest possible social and economic status. Number two, as such, its ethnic character relative to modern slavery is very different. It was much more a neutral, flexible, and varied institution, and blanket ethnic pronouncements against it or for it would have been inaccurate. According to the institution itself could not be considered inconsistent with the gospel of freedom, and the New Testament clearly denies the idea that a master owns a servant. Only the Lord owns them both. Given this character of the institution, the New Testament teachings address obvious problems with the praxis and role enactments. The general Christian principle of freedom creates several passages that encourage the church to move away from and avoid the practice. The general view of the New Testament that changes should be instituted from the inside outward and should be a matter of individual moral decision, which explains the book of Philemon. The complexity of the historical situation also argues against feasibility of any unilateral abolition during that time. Accordingly, we cannot correctly accuse the New Testament of condoning slavery in any traditional sense. The use of the servant heart of Jesus as a goal did not legitimize the institution in any way, and the anti-slavery injunctions clearly show that. The New Testament does not expect unconditional obedience to masters. Indeed, it required disobedience in case of moral wrongdoing. The New Testament literature is too occasional and too early to be expected to deal with all the social implications of the good news of God's actions in Jesus Christ, but we do have a strong pro-freedom elements and instructions therein anyway. The early church saw the institution itself as neutral and useful for raising funds for social relief, yet demonstrated a decided preference for freedom. Now, what emerges from this is rather detailed study is that most of the passages in the New Testament relating to slavery were not even speaking about what we would consider slavery today, or New World slavery. Given what slavery was like in Paul's day, we should not be morally surprised at the absence of the blanket freedom statements by him, or at the absence of a major empire-wide or anti-slavery campaign on the part of the emerging church. The data we do have in the New Testament lays clear groundwork for refuting New World slavery, almost all of which was based on slave trading and piracy, and that was explicitly condemned by Paul and fought by the early church. By the time slavery loses its ambiguous or ethnically ambiguous character as an institution, in other words, the slave trade of the New World, or slavery as we now know it, it cannot legitimately use Paul to defend itself, for it had mutated into something quite unlike either Hebrew slavery, as sanctioned by the Old Law, or the Roman household slavery that we are familiar with in the New Testament. One final point, and I've already made this point, and that's Christians were known for selling themselves into slavery to buy food for poor Christians and to free other Christians. And this is what happened during the early church and during the apostles' time. Okay, I've dealt with all the issues in the New Testament all the way through the early church. I want to make one more video, and I want to discuss the abolitionist movement a little bit and modern slavery, and then I'm going to wrap up the whole series on slavery in the Bible. Thanks.